the next steps and resources are available moving forward. So with that, fire hazard severity zones, first, they're not new. They've been around in California since the 1980s. They started out as being really designated for the state responsibility areas, and they were from the result of some wildfires down in Southern California. In the early 1990s, I believe it was 1991, you had the Tunnel Fire, which is also more widely known as the Oakland Hills Fire. That prompted some additional regulations to put these fire hazard severity zones into the local responsibility area that I had mentioned before. So those are your towns, your cities, counties, special districts, those with local responsibility. And so out of that regulation, the first maps came in at around 2007, 2008. And that's really the first time that there was a substantial effort done to map these areas. And the town subsequently had to adopt those very high fire severity zones at that time. The regulations have since changed since that time, where there's additional categorizations, including high fire severity zone and moderate fire severity zones. And so that update that was recently done was first done at the state level, and those were formally adopted in 2024 in April, and that was after a several-year process. And these updates that were done from the 2007-2008 timeframe are really done based on much improved modeling that they're able to do, improved climate data, and more improved fire history. And you're going to learn more about that next in this video. It is a fairly lengthy video, so it's about 14 minutes long. In the middle of it, they do provide a great detailed explanation on how these zones were developed. So very informative, and I'll turn it over to CAL FIRE at this time.
Welcome to the Fire Hazard Severity Zone rollout for the local responsibility areas within California. The Office of the State Fire Marshal is thrilled to have you here.
If you have specific questions, please visit the Contact CAL FIRE page within the Fire Hazard Severity Zone hub. Use our interactive map to find your local CAL FIRE representative. Once you have identified your representative, you can schedule an appointment using our online calendar.
Today, we are here to introduce the history and background of fire hazard severity zones, the science behind the maps, and the local requirements.
Fire hazard severity zones are not new in the state of California. Historically, as a state, we've learned from past wildfires to improve regulation. The Panorama Fire in 1980 marked the beginning of these important changes in state responsibility area.
The Panorama Fire began in the San Bernardino Mountains, pushed by Santa Ana winds, ultimately burning 28,800 acres, destroying 325 structures, and resulting in 4 fatalities. In response to this fire, Public Resource Code 4201 mandated CAL FIRE to develop fire hazard severity zones in state responsibility area.
11 years after the Panorama Fire, the Tunnel Fire, famously known as the Oakland Hills Fire, devastated a community that was not previously identified as a hazard zone because it was in local responsibility area.
At the time, it was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire on record, burning 1,520 acres, destroying 2,900 structures, and resulting in 25 fatalities. This catastrophic event prompted legislators to adopt Assembly Bill 337, also known as the Bates Bill.
This legislation mandated the Director of CAL FIRE to assess fire hazard severity zones within the local responsibility area and propose recommendations to identify very high fire hazard severity zones to the local agencies. Subsequently, Government Code Section 51179 obligates the local authority to take mitigating actions.
Government Code outlines our responsibility as a state agency. Who? The State Fire Marshal is tasked with identifying fire hazard severity zones statewide.
What? This involves categorizing areas in the state as moderate, high, or very high fire hazard severity zone.
Why? The hazard mapping process will incorporate new science, local climate data, and improved fire assessment modeling in determining hazard ratings. The aim is to mitigate wildfire damage by considering factors such as fuel loading, slope, fire weather, and wind. We will now watch a short video on the science and methods behind the maps.
Hello, I'm Jamie. I'm a member of the CAL FIRE modeling team that developed the Fire Hazard Severity Zone map for California. Fire hazard severity zone maps are built to describe relative wildland and urban interface fire hazard potential over the long term for all areas of the state. The zones reflect areas that have similar burn probabilities and fire behavior characteristics and are split into 3 classes: moderate, high, and very high. To explain the methods used in building fire hazard severity zones, we will show the sequence of steps and some key data inputs, zooming in on the north-central part of Butte County near the cities of Chico and Paradise as an example. The same steps were used statewide. Different steps were taken for modeling fire hazard severity zones in wildland areas and non-wildland areas. Wildland areas include places such as forests, grasslands, and shrublands where the land cover is dominated by vegetation. In these areas, we can apply well-established scientific methods to model fire behavior such as spread and intensity. The potential fire behavior is combined with the likelihood of fire to get an estimate of the hazard. Non-wildland areas include urban, agricultural, and barren lands, and water or wetlands. In these areas, hazard arises due to embers coming in from adjacent wildlands and associated fire spread through urban vegetation and structures. We estimate hazard in non-wildland based on the number of embers, where those embers are likely to land based on local wind patterns and the slope and tree cover within the area, which can increase the chance of fire ignition and spread. The first step in building fire hazard severity zone maps is to define the zones, areas of the map where fire hazard severity zone scores are determined and a classification is calculated. The zones aim to capture patches of similar fire behavior potential or fire environments. Fire hazard severity zone classes are ultimately applied across an entire zone. The data inputs for developing the zone boundaries include slope and vegetation. Areas that have similar slope and flammability are aggregated or grouped into zones. There is no maximum zone size, but there is a minimum size of 200 acres for continuous wildlands and smaller for islands of wildlands surrounded by urban and agricultural lands. The fire hazard severity model for wildland fire has 2 key elements: probability of an area burning and expected fire behavior under extreme fuel and weather conditions. The probability of an area burning was calculated using fire history for the years 1991 to 2020. Knowing how much area burned within broadly similar areas of vegetation and climate allows us to calculate the annual likelihood of a fire occurring in that area. We then estimate the potential flame length if fire were to occur based on vegetation type, slope, and the local climate. Vegetation type and climate allow us to understand how much fuel may be present and how dry or available to burn it may be. Because fire hazard severity zones are intended to measure the potential hazard across multiple decades, we use a long-term look at fuel development and do not adjust our data inputs to account for recent fires or fuel management activities. We want to know what a fire could be like under the worst fuel conditions that may occur in an area. Similarly, for climate data, we use the worst 5% of fire weather observations that occurred on days when the weather is dry enough to carry fire. This allows us to capture areas that have infrequent but regular occurrences of hot, dry, and windy conditions and include that in our estimate of hazard. We then combine the probability of fire with the potential flame length to get a final score for hazard in wildland areas. All the scores within a zone are averaged to get a final value for that zone, and the zones are summarized into final classes of moderate, high, or very high. The first step in estimating hazard in non-wildlands is to model ember transport out of adjacent wildlands. Remember that non-wildlands include urban, agricultural, and barren lands, and water or wetlands, and that the hazard in these areas comes from adjacent wildland. To model embers falling onto these lands, we must consider how many may be produced and where they are likely to land in the event of a wildfire. The number of embers, also known as firebrands, produced in the wildland is a function of vegetation type, modeled flame length, and burn probability. We model the dispersal of embers into non-wildland areas under the worst local fire weather conditions when fires are more likely to challenge containment efforts. For example, if the worst fire weather at a given location tends to have winds predominantly out of the northeast at 40 miles per hour, modeled firebrands go predominantly to the southwest and go a greater maximum distance than they would at a site with predominantly 20 mile per hour winds. We then add up all the embers coming into the non-wildland to get an estimate of the relative number or brand load landing in a given location. We build fire hazard severity zones in non-wildland areas by generating buffers off any adjacent wildland. The initial zone classification is the same as the adjacent wildland, with buffers of lower fire hazard severity zone classes modeled at further distances from the wildland boundary. In addition to brand load, we include slope and tree cover in generating fire hazard severity zone buffers, as these factors can promote greater fire ignition and spread. The width of the fire hazard severity zone buffer is wider in areas that have higher brand load, steeper slope, and greater tree cover. Let's go through that sequence again, zooming in on a neighborhood at the wildland-urban interface and focusing on how the cost surface is calculated to build the FHSC buffers. The black line in the image represents the boundary between wildland and non-wildland. The non-wildland area, shown in gray, will be zoned by buffer. The three input variables, brand load, slope, and tree cover, are used to calculate a cost surface, which is then used to determine the width of FHSC buffers. The first input is classified brand load, which has values of 0, 1, 2, or 3, reflecting increasing amounts of mottled embers or firebrands impacting an area. As mentioned before, the brand load is a function of vegetation type and burn probability in the adjacent wildland and the wind patterns in the area. More embers landing on a grid cell will result in a lower value in the cost surface and wider buffers of FHSC. The second input is classified slope, which has a value of 1 for areas with slope less than 20% and a value of 2 for areas with slope greater than 20%. Steeper slopes result in a lower value in the cost surface in that area and wider buffers of FHSC. The final input is classified tree cover, which has values of 1, 2, or 3, reflecting increasing tree cover. Greater tree cover results in a lower cost surface value and wider buffers of FHSC. To calculate the cost surface, the class values for brand load, slope, and tree cover are added together for each grid cell. This value ranges from 2 to 9. Higher numbers reflect a greater potential for fire ignition or spread. We then take the inverse of that sum and scale the value so that the cost surface ranges from 10 to 40. Higher cost implies lower potential for fire spread. The cost surface, reflecting each grid cell's value for brand load, slope, and tree cover, is then used to calculate the width of FHSC buffers. Moving along a line from the wildland edge, the values of sequential grid cells are summed together until the total exceeds the specified value shown in the table. The FHSC class of the first buffer adjacent to the wildland is the same as the FHSC class in the adjacent wildland. As cost surface values are added up, the buffer transitions to lower FHSC classes. In non-wildland, areas that are sufficiently far from hazardous wildlands can remain unzoned, in contrast to wildland areas, which always receive a zone designation. This completes the modeling process for fire hazard severity zones across all lands in the state. Once we have a final fire hazard severity zone map for all lands, the final step in map development is to extract state responsibility areas to fulfill the requirements of the regulatory process. If you have further questions on the zoning methods, please visit the Fire Hazard Severity Zone website for more information on the model and the project in general.
Several crucial factors highlight the current update of the map. This includes advancements in scientific factors determining hazard ratings, encompassing new local climate data, and enhanced fire assessment modeling.
The process began with legislation from 2022, specifically Assembly Bill 642 and Senate Bill 63, mandating CAL FIRE to identify and map areas within the local responsibility area as moderate, high, or very high fire hazard severity zones.
These updates encompass improvements in technology, burn probabilities, fire environment, vegetation density, slope, localized fire weather, and new firebrand production and transport modeling using localized wind data.
A common misconception lies in understanding the distinction between hazard and risk as they're related to the map.
Hazard is based on the physical conditions that create the likelihood and expected fire behavior over a 50-year period without considering mitigation measures such as home hardening, recent wildfire, or fuel management efforts. Risk is the potential damage a fire can cause due to the area under existing conditions, accounting for any mitigations such as fuel management, defensible space, and ignition-resistant building construction.
The Fire Hazard Severity Zone map evaluates hazard as opposed to risk. It operates similarly to flood zone maps, characterizing areas based on the probability of a particular area being affected by fire, rather than explicitly outlining the specific impacts.
CAL FIRE's goal is to assist local agencies with enhancing life and property safety. CAL FIRE works closely with the building industry when setting various building codes and defensible space requirements. We collaborate not to impede development, but to ensure that development mitigations align with the hazards inherent to the area.
This diagram displays the requirements based on hazard zone and responsibility area. As you can see, the requirements for SRA for each zone has remained the same. In the LRA, the updates are focused on the high and moderate zones.
The local agency requirements begin with a transmittal from the state fire marshal that identifies fire hazard severity zones.
This begins two simultaneous timelines. First, within 30 days of receiving transmittal, local agencies shall make the information available for public review and comment. Second, 120 days after receiving the transmittal, local agencies shall designate by ordinance moderate, high, and very high fire hazard severity zones.
The final requirement is submitting to the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. Within 30 days of adopting a local ordinance, you must submit a map depicting the adopted fire hazard severity zones within the local agency, the ordinance of map adoption, and any items outlined in regulation through the online form available on the board's website. Once submitted, you will receive confirmation which marks completion of the requirement.
For more information, please review the resources available in the Fire Hazard Severity Zone Hub. Thank you for watching the Fire Hazard Severity Zone rollout presentation for local responsibility areas within California.
All right, so a lot of information, a fairly lengthy video, but really, I think does a good job at talking about how these really started and where we're at today, including a lot of the science behind what the zones look like. And I know it's a lot to take in, especially or even for somebody that looks at that kind of stuff quite a bit. But really, what does that mean for Truckee? And it ultimately comes down to regulations related to wildfire. And so as they quickly went over what those regulations looked like, but I wanted to take a little bit more time and point it out. So for those moderate zones, really the town's responsibility is only to adopt that fire hazard severity zone. There aren't additional regulations pertaining to building code or anything like that in the moderate zones. When you get to high, that's where some of those additional regulations come in. So the Chapter 7A building code is they call it WUI, Wildland Urban Interface, which has some additional hardening measures that help protect a structure against wildfire. Additionally, hazard disclosure, that's for real estate. And so in the high, you have to disclose that the property is within a high fire severity zone. Now, when you get to very high, it's everything above so everything included in the high and moderate. But additionally, there's defensible space regulations for that 100 feet around a structure, safety element requirements. So that's really a planning portion on the town side. Some fire safe regulations, including, those are a lot more of those fire code items, subdivision map act, subdivision review, and then some environmental implications as well if there's any development. The subdivision review real quick is, there's through Assembly Bill 2911 mandates the state to assess neighborhoods within jurisdictions that have 30 or more parcels within that neighborhood that only have one way in and out. And so what they do is they identify these subdivisions and give some recommendations on how to improve ingress and egress during an emergency. So what are some of the required actions and options that the town has? First, we have to make the information publicly available. And so we did that. We received these. It's within 30 days of receiving the maps. So we received the updated maps on February 10th. On February 25th, we provided a presentation to council at the town council meeting, and a website about all the information went live on that day. And I'll share that website with you at the end of this. And so we had to do that within 30 days of receiving the maps, and then we also have to adopt by ordinance a map of the very high fire severity zones, and that has to be done within 120 days of receiving the map. So that puts us at June 10th. Now, the town may increase the CAL FIRE recommendations. So if it increases any zones to very high, that has to be substantiated by evidence that's submitted to the Board of Forestry. But it is within the entire discretion within the town to be able to designate an area as high or moderate if they aren't already mapped that way. What we cannot do is decrease any of the zone recommendations. And so there's no avenue to be able to do that. So real quick, I wanted to point out what these zone changes look like versus the 2008 maps and the recommended zones. So on the top portion of this slide, that dark red is the very high fire severity zones that were mapped. That pink area is federal responsibility area. So the state is not required to map that, and that was not covered then, and it is not covered now. And so if you look at the bottom portion of that map, a few changes. One, you have a lot more of that red, which is the very high fire severity zone. And then it also introduces that orange, which is the high fire severity zone, and the yellow, which is moderate. And so there's only a couple slivers of that moderate. Otherwise, it's high or very high. One thing I did want to point out, because it's not, at first it wasn't intuitive to me that it was mapped on Donner Lake, that there would be a very high fire severity zone on a body of water. However, they take that 50-year time horizon at looking at that hazard under no mitigation circumstances. And so they mapped that with the idea that there could be whether houseboats or structures built on the lake, or maybe 50 years down the road, Donner Lake is decided or just drains out because of drought, and there could be development or structures there. So that's the mindset that they took when mapping those areas. So also wanted to talk about what I mentioned before, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan and how it relates to these fire hazard severity zones. Well, as CAL FIRE mentioned, those fire hazard severity zones are hazard-based. So they did a good job at talking about what that means from like a flood standpoint, similar to flood maps. I like to compare both flood and earthquake as a hazard and comparing the way they use this methodology. So those fault lines with an earthquake, those are there. We have that hazard there. However, there are mitigation steps that you could take that could eliminate a risk associated with that hazard. So if you happen to have the money to build your house on base isolators to where the ground shook around you, your house doesn't have a huge risk of being impacted by that hazard. However, the approach that CAL FIRE takes is really just that hazard being there. That hazard exists. It doesn't consider any short-term mitigation measures, and that's the approach for that. For the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, it took a risk-based approach. And so what is that risk there that is related to the hazard, but really that risk takes into account what mitigation measures can we take at the household level, at the community level, to help reduce the threat of wildfire from the hazard. And so this is a good map which shows that risk assessment, which looks a lot different than what the hazard assessment looks like from CAL FIRE. And so if anybody has any questions about that, there would be a great opportunity to ask them at the end of it. We have the people that developed that plan here, and so we can speak to that later as well. So what do these next steps look like? What does the adoption process look like? Right now, we're doing public outreach. So we're very thankful for you coming in and being part of this process, because we can't make this decision, in a bubble. This is a whole community thing. And so your feedback is super vital in this process. Coming up, there will be some public hearings when the ordinance is first proposed and ultimately adopted. Once we finish those steps, we will need to transmit the ordinance and adopted map to CAL FIRE. And then what comes after that is really the implementation of all those regulations and how they impact Truckee. So I mentioned some resources. So we did develop a pretty handy web page that's townoftruckee.gov/FHSZ update. That stands for Fire Hazard Severity Zone Update. You could also, if you don't remember that website, really easy, go to townoftruckee.gov, and it's a quick button right there at the home page that you can get into. Also, if anybody wanted to provide additional public comment, for those that are here tonight, wanted to provide additional public comment, or anybody that's at home, watching at home or watching this at a later date, can email the town at FHSZupdate@townoftruckee.gov. And so with that, I wanted to open it up to everyone here tonight. If there's any questions or just statements that you want to make, what I would ask is that you would go up to the podium over there and press the speaker button. A couple of reasons for that, as I mentioned, we are having Spanish interpretation here, and so we want to make sure that that gets captured for our interpreter and also for those at home as well. Thank you. Any questions? There might not be any. We have one. Okay, thank you.
I guess I wanted to ask the question that most of this is more about what the town, from a future development point, is going to have to consider based on the zones. So that's one question. Second one is, based on these zones, will there be other required mitigation efforts or something that will be required on personal property? And third, I'm sure you guys don't know this, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you believe that any of these different zones will have any impact on getting an insurance policy?
Thank you very much. And so I'll start out with your last question. So the impact on insurance, and it's a good question and a common one. And so for the California Department of Insurance put out in a statement that it's unlikely to have an impact on insurance. And the reasoning behind it is because insurance functions on a risk basis rather than a hazard basis. And so if you think about that flood, for instance, as a hazard, if you build your house within a flood zone and it's at the elevation of the river and you don't take any mitigation actions, then that hazard ultimately has a very high risk of damaging your home if the level of the river rises. However, if you did build your house on stilts that were well above the flood zones, the risk of damage to that property reduces significantly, almost goes away. And so that's the way that it's really being looked at. And what the Department of Insurance is saying is that these are really hazard maps in that they don't directly tie to the risk assessment that the insurance industry uses and the underwriters use when making insurance decisions. And so for the question on what does this look like at the parcel level, at the homeowner level? There are regulations. So I mentioned the defensible space. So there are 100-foot defensible space requirements. The town is working with the Fire Protection District to put together a defensible space ordinance. So it would really shape what that ultimately looks like here in Truckee. There is some guidance at the state level on what that looks like. There's different zones. So you'll hear about zone 0. It's the first 0 to 5 feet from your house, which is really important from that ember intrusion. And then you have additional zones, zone 1, which is that 5 to 30 feet, and then 30 to 100 feet from your property. And there's different recommendations within each of those zones on what you can do to help reduce the likelihood that a wildfire is going to make it all the way to your property and burn your structure. And so when it comes to your first question with the development side of it, there will likely be some impacts based on the zone designations and what may or may not be achievable from a development standpoint. And so the subject matter experts, much less in my world, much more in our community development planning world and our fire marshal world on what that ultimately looks like. And so there are steps that you can overcome some of these challenges. So egress issues, and there's just a lot more that comes to wildfire mitigation in those zones than if you lived in an area where there wasn't that hazard. I don't know if there's any specific comments that you have related to development within very high fire severity zones and what that might look like, how that might change the development landscape in the town.
Yeah, would you mind putting that slide up that had your 3 colors with the requirements? Yeah, that one there. So one thing that I wanted to hit on with this is that the Chapter 7A building code requirements are already a requirement in the town municipal code throughout the town of Truckee, regardless of these new maps. So that's something that's already being implemented as of current. And that's something that we're looking at to continue, throughout the fire district. So we're looking at it as like a more macro level rather than that kind of granular, like what color is the pixel? Because the entire area, based like on our CWPP map, it's the community risk as a whole is what we're trying to mitigate. So that's already in play. The real estate disclosure, that's something that Truckee Fire was proactive about before AB 38. So that's something that we've already been doing since 2019. So that's already in play, and that's throughout the fire district as well. So that's not just based on the color of the pixel. The defensible space, we currently have a defensible space ordinance that we're working on doing an update on. But we also apply that throughout the fire district, not just based on the colors of the zones. So there's really not going to be any significant change based on the mapping in that regard. The safety element, that's something that the town recently updated. But part of that, and then we'll kind of tie this into the CEQA piece as well, is that up until about 2017, wildfire was not considered in an EIR in the CEQA document. When you did an environmental impact review for a new development, wildfire wasn't even part of that until about 2017. So that has been kind of in play for new developments. And then we also adopt the fire code on a triennial cycle. So every time that it updates, the fire district and the town also update the fire code. And a lot of the stuff that's in that very high piece is already in the fire code. And it's a lot of what we're doing currently throughout the fire district. So I don't think you're going to see any like super significant impacts at maybe like the parcel level in that regard as far as how we're conducting our operation to mitigate that risk piece. But I do think that there is a developing landscape with some of the land use planning. And I think that I have as many questions as you do about that because it's kind of a little bit of a new thing. And this is also kind of a statewide question as well. So it's a little bit of a developing landscape there. No pun intended.
Any other questions? Statements are also acceptable too.
What does the town foresee or the fire district foresee for like actionable measures that you're going to take once the zones have been updated? And like, what are the regulations you think you're going to implement? Is it a carrot or a stick approach? I'm not very well informed, so like help me out with this one.
Do you want to take that at least from I mean, really, he kind of covered it a little bit on what it looks like. It's essentially carrying forward a lot of what we've been doing, but it just comes with a lot more state requirements. You're able to, enforce additional measures. So he mentioned the Chapter 7A that's been around for the entire town. The state didn't require that, but it's just smart planning from an area that's prone to wildfire. And so that's not unique in Truckee. Some agencies throughout the entire state have taken that approach over the years. And so really what it comes down to is that, we see wildfire as a huge concern. It's one of our council priorities to address. And so that'll continue. And so we'll continue carrying the torch of helping mitigate against wildfire the best we can and just bringing the whole community in because it is a whole community effort. Whether it's coming down to regulations and enforcing defensible space and also taking personal responsibility within, this community and being able to, achieve a holistic impact from this threat. And I don't know if you want to add on to more of that.
Is there money out there to assist financially like insolvent homeowners with large tree removal?
Can I answer the first part of your question, and then I'll turf that second part to Eric. So in the fire prevention world, basically the 3 E's that we operate under engineering controls. So we look at material design, right? So the evolution of non-combustible components that we didn't have 50, 60 years ago. So you think about like a cedar shake roof that was super popular, back in the 40s and 50s. It was an available material. The wildfire threat wasn't that big of an issue. It hadn't been identified as a hazard. But now through engineering controls, we have metal roofs, we have Class A roofs, things of that nature. The other piece that kind of ties in with the engineering controls is the updates in the fire code adoption. So by updating the fire code every 3 years, and that's not something that we do here locally, we do amend it and we add some more restrictions, but that's actually the International Code Council. So, this is a body of people that goes outside the United States. This is like a subject matter expert think tank, and every 3 years they look at all this information, all this data, and they update the codes that we adopt. So that also includes the building codes. Another big piece, and I think this is what we're doing right here tonight, is education. So if we can get the information out to people so that you understand the why piece, then that empowers you guys to make those changes. You understand the importance of like, hey, why do I need to get rid of my wood shake roof and put on, Class A roof assembly? Like, well, here's the why piece. Why do I need zone 0? It's like, well, studies have shown that that's like the leading cause for ignitions in that 0 to 5 foot zone. And then lastly is the enforcement piece. So you were talking about the carrot and the stick, right? So, that is a tool in the toolbox, but that really is the least effective tool. And kind of to tie into the earlier question with the insurance piece is really the insurance companies carrying the stick. So a lot of the things that they look at when they do these risk profiles are all the things that we're looking at with this engineering controls, with the defensible space. Basically all the mitigation work that, Eric's and my team are working on is to try to address those issues that insurance companies would have when they look at the risk profile of a structure. So that's really kind of how it ties in. But, we don't want to be the ones that are going to show up to your street and say, hey, here's a citation because you don't have, your defensible space. We want to educate you why you need your defensible space. That way, better for us, you can go talk to your neighbor and say, hey, like, can I help you with your defensible space? And we get that community approach. So, that answer your question?
Thanks. I have a bit more to add to that too that I wanted to mention. So, with the recent passage of Measure E in the town and the existence of Measure T, we're really looking at we're exploring the idea of really creating some more meaningful programs for the community that can help mitigate against things. So Measure T offers some good rebates and programs that people can do on some of the smaller parcel level projects to be able to improve mitigation. So what we're looking at right now is whether it might make sense to have an incentive program for more larger projects at the parcel level, because we understand a lot of these mitigation actions are costly, whether it's replacing a roof or taking a fence out or moving wood structures or firewood away from your house in areas that are non-combustible sheds or things like that. It's costly, and so we're looking at the potential. And of course, none of this has yet been approved or presented to council yet, and so can't make any guarantees that this is ultimately where we'll land. But we're really taking a hard look at trying to make it more accessible for all community members, especially those that have less financial means.
Hi, my name's Bob Ferwerda, and I hear what you say about wood shake roofs. But what amazed me is within the last year, there was a change in the municipal code that allows wood shake roofs. I don't know where it came from, and I don't know that anybody is stupid enough to do that, but the town of Truckee has that provision in a certain section of the development code. My next question is, and I've been looking into this a little bit, insurance kind of ties itself to the ISO rating. That's an insurance company rating. And my question for the fire district is, why is our ISO rating at 4 when Incline Village and South Lake Tahoe are at 1? Since we live in such a high hazard zone, why don't we have the facilities to get our rating down? Has the fire district looked at that, or what's the obstacles of reducing that number?
Just real quick before you dive into the ISO rating, I did want to mention, so part of that work plan and what we're trying to work towards on improving things like wood shake roofs and development code issues is trying to take a really good look at all the ins and outs of the development code and seeing where it might not really mesh well with a threat of wildfire. And so being able to really take a look at front to back areas that might conflict with the wildfire hazard out there and identify ways that we can fix that And that would really be a precursor to a lot of those incentive programs that we might be able to get towards, to where you identify those projects, they're in line with the development code, the building code, landscaping ordinances, and all that. So it's something that we are looking at for sure. And then I'll turn it over to the fire district to talk about the ISO rating, which I do know comes a lot down to resources.
I just want to answer your question. The development code only applies to new stuff, which is only a fraction of a % of the stock that we have with. The real issue, if you're going to develop a resistivity to a fire, is you got to retrofit all what's existing. And so, I think the town's got a responsibility to come up with programs to do that.
Yeah, thank you. And exactly what we're looking at. Thank you.
We want to talk about ISO?
Yeah, and I can kind of tag on to the existing built environment. I mean, that is one of the biggest challenges that we face because it's an evolving problem, right? You know how we talked about we got structures from the 30s that had wood shake roofs. Well, back in the 30s, we didn't have fire codes, we didn't have local municipal ordinances, things of that nature. So as we've evolved as a society, we've realized like, hey, there's these things out here that can kill us and hurt us as a community that we need to mitigate. To go back and retrofit a lot of this built environment is obviously a challenge. But where we do have some traction and some availability with that is if you pull a new building permit to either do an addition, major modification, tenant improvement, thing of that nature, we can require some upgrades. So like one great example, like Bar of America, we got fire sprinklers in that building as part of their tenant improvement. So when that building was built, fire sprinklers weren't part of the code. But now we were able, through that permitting process, to upgrade some of that fire and life safety piece. And to your point as well, looking at some new projects based on the scope, we are looking at requiring retrofits to the existing structure to bring it up to a 7A compliance.
Okay, but that's still a very small fraction of the total housing plan or building plant kind of thing. I think if we want to not burn in the next 50 years, because that's what I'm hearing from the severity maps, you've got to toughen up everything. And you've got to have the programs, because the option of a Paradise or an LA fire is not acceptable. And so, but again, why is our ISO rating so low?
Yeah, so the ISO rating, the big part of that is they look at the availability of fire water and they look at resource deployment. So the reason the incline has geographically an advantage over us is their fire district is quite a bit smaller. Their built environment is very dense. So it's easy to have fewer fire stations serve a bigger population area. It's more of a metropolitan district, if you will, versus our fire district's 124 square miles, and we have 4 fire stations. So to try to achieve a fire station within 5 miles of every built parcel, we would need quite a few more fire stations. And unfortunately, our revenue will not support that. So that's a huge challenge that we have, is that resource deployment piece based on the size of the community that we serve and the budget that we have.
Yeah, the other piece. My point is we've got to augment the budget so we can get our ISO down, so we can get insurance at an affordable price. They kind of all connect with each other. Thank you.
If you wouldn't mind, so the question was how about that big tree removal? And Eric, did you have an answer for that?
Yeah, well, just first off, thanks for being here, everybody. I think it's great to see the community, rally around the topic of wildfire. I think it's really impactful for everyone to be here. And, fortunately, with the community kind of putting their money in Measure T and stepping up this wildfire prevention division at Truckee Fires, we have been able to be a lot more proactive and put ourselves on the map as a leader in moving towards wildfire resilient communities. And I think the sentiment that we have, 15,000 existing structures in our fire district that need to comply with the best of the best defensible space and home hardening retrofits is where we're at, right? We need every single property owner to take action. They need to start with their structure, right? With their vents, with their fences. They need to start with zone 0, completely going non-combustible, hardscaping, moving towards that wildfire prepared home type of a designation that insurance even recognizes. So that's where we're at. So we have rolled out these last 3 years kind of all of our core programs. And the last couple we have at Truckee Fire is a dead tree fund program, so helping out with the dead tree piece. Most of the time we can actually achieve pretty good risk reduction in defensible space without removing large trees. Right? Those are super costly. Large trees are not the driver of crazy flame lengths in our fuel type here, right? If we can disconnect the surface fuels on the ground, your shrubs, your tree limbs, and your small trees from our overstory large healthy trees, you can kind of break up that fire pathway from the ground to the tree crown. So we're taking that more fuel reduction approach, rearrangement. And so we're going to be rolling out a dead tree fund this summer that's going to be providing some assistance, whether it's 100% or a form of cost share rebate, to help out with the removal of dead trees. We've completed defensible space inspections across about 13,000 structures in our fire district in the last 3 years, and our stats tell us 1 out of 6 homes has a dead tree. So it's an issue, right? And we know how costly they are. It can quickly be in the thousands of dollars to have one large dead tree removed. So that is a program coming up this year, so stay in touch for that. We have a home hardening retrofit rebate in place for those low cost, high priority retrofits. So if you're upgrading things like vents, removing wood fences, replacing them with metal, kind of those deck replacements, things that are that low cost, high priority, we have a great rebate program, to basically reimburse 50% of your costs up to $500. We're looking at increasing that, maybe up into the $1,000 or higher as we move forward, just because we know these things are so expensive and it's so important to get our homes back to a resilient condition. So we're in a cool spot. We got community here. We got Firewise communities, right? 90% of our homes have an active Firewise community, which is a volunteer community trying to push forward, this kind of lead from the neighborhood level, take on the actions locally, and really rally the neighborhood to do everything we can. So I think it's a good opportunity for us to take control of what we can and see some good alignment happen with defensible space that exceeds what's needed, aligns with insurance, and rolls out through all of our different, development and landscaping and all that. Let's get everything aligned. Let's really think about fire and think about staying resilient.
And I did want to mention too, so one of the things, the state did add this defensible space requirement in the state responsibility area several years ago. And it was really put on the state fire marshal to determine what does that regulation look like, because it is a challenge, right? New development's a lot easier. You can make that happen, but it's the getting people into compliance. And one of the challenges is the high cost to be able to do that at the home by home basis. And so they understand it's a problem. It's caused delays in what that regulation looks like. The governor just issued an order to really get it figured out sooner than later. We're taking a look at that, of course, here and what that ultimately would look like in Truckee to be able to bring that out. But I wanted to point that out as well. It's a tough issue to wrangle with. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, I would again like to really thank everybody for taking the time out of their lives to be here tonight. It really means a lot to us that you're here providing this feedback and comments. This doesn't end right now. So if you go home and you have additional comments or questions, please feel free to reach out. We have the contact information there on the screen. FHSZ update at townoftruckee.gov, and also there, townoftruckee.gov's website. We have a great informational page about what the process looks like, and we'll continue to provide updates to the community as we go through this adoption process. So thank you again. Have a good evening.